5 months into what American cable news branded Operation Epic Fury, the war the United States and Israel launched against Iran on February 28, 2026 has not produced the collapse anyone in Washington predicted. On the morning of July 28th, two separate statements came out of Tehran within hours of each other, and taken together, they say more about the state of this war than any battlefield map. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, responding to a Ukrainian drone strike that had killed a sailor aboard an Iranian cargo vessel in the Caspian Sea 2 days earlier, called the attack a violation of the UN Charter that cannot go unanswered. At nearly the same moment, Iran was absorbing the political fallout of a very different event closer to home, the public hanging of two young men, Abolfazl Sipahi Bajani and Amir Hossein Safari Hossein-Abadi, in Isfahan's Alakhani Square, over their alleged role in the January 2026 protest wave that briefly rattled the government. Two crises, two officials, one government trying to manage both an external war and an internal reckoning on the same day. Start with the Caspian Sea, because it is the clearest evidence that this conflict has stopped being contained to the territory anyone originally drew a line around. On July 25th, Ukrainian drones struck vessels near Russia's Astrakhan port, hitting what Kyiv described as sanctioned cargo ships ferrying military material between Iran and Russia, alongside a Russian warship. Iran told a different story, that the target was a commercial vessel, the Anna, and that the strike killed one Iranian sailor and wounded several others, the first Iranian death from Ukrainian fire. Whatever the truth of the cargo manifest, the strategic fact is not in dispute. A war that began as a bilateral campaign against Iran's nuclear and missile infrastructure has now drawn in a third combatant fighting an entirely separate war on an inland sea that Iran has treated as its own strategic backyard for decades. Araghchi's public read on the incident was that Israel had encouraged Ukraine into it specifically to drag European governments deeper into the confrontation, an accusation Kyiv denies, but one that fits a pattern Iran has been eager to publicize. That this is no longer a two-country fight, it is a regional one, absorbing new participants by the week. That pattern of expansion is visible closer to the alliance structure, holding the American side together too. NATO has not presented a unified front behind Washington's campaign. Spain shut its airspace and its jointly operated bases to any American operation tied to the Iran war back in March, with its defense minister calling the conflict profoundly illegal, and its government went on to permanently withdraw its ambassador from Israel. France's President Emmanuel Macron said publicly in July that while Iran bears primary responsibility for the war, the American and Israeli strikes themselves fell outside the bounds of international law. Trump responded to Spain specifically by calling the country a terrible partner and threatening to cut off trade with it. This is not the language of an alliance operating in lockstep. It is two of America's most significant European partners publicly branding the campaign illegal, while Washington still needs their airspace, their bases, and their diplomatic cover to sustain it. Inside Iran, the government's answer to 5 months of military pressure and a January protest wave has been unambiguous: escalating use of the death penalty. The two men executed in Isfahan on July 28th were convicted in connection with the killing of 4 security officers during protests on January 8th, part of a 12-person case in which UN human rights experts have already raised serious concerns about coerced confessions and closed trials. They were not the first executions tied to that case. 2 other defendants were hanged on July 19th, and rights groups tracking the crackdown say at least 24 people have been executed in connection with the January unrest since the start of the year. Footage from Isfahan showed crowds gathering near the execution site, chanting against the police before being dispersed with tear gas, and an online petition against the death penalty reportedly gathered roughly 500,000 signatures within a day. The government is not hiding this strategy, it is broadcasting it on state television as a deterrent, a signal to anyone still considering organized dissent during wartime that the security services know who was involved and that the cost of involvement is public and final. The same week produced the most consequential diplomatic meeting since the war began, Donald Trump hosting Benjamin Netanyahu at the White House on July 28th, their first face-to-face encounter since the two governments jointly launched the campaign against Iran in February. The meeting did not happen without friction. Trump told Fox News he was frustrated with Netanyahu just hours before the sit-down, and Israeli officials briefed reporters that Washington was pushing Israel to pull back its forces from positions in Lebanon, Syria, and Gaza, a request Netanyahu reportedly told his own security cabinet he intended to resist. What did move ahead of the meeting was Gaza. Israel's security cabinet approved the entry of roughly 200 troops from an international stabilization force into a pilot humanitarian zone, a concession multiple Israeli outlets reported was arranged specifically to secure the Washington meeting in the first place. Both leaders had reasons to need this photograph. Trump is heading into a midterm election environment shaped by elevated oil prices and a military campaign with no declared endgame, from a president who built his political identity on ending, not starting, Middle Eastern wars. Netanyahu is heading into his own election on October 27th, with domestic polling in the United States showing eroding American public support for Israel's conduct in Gaza, and with his political survival tied, as it has been for years, to his ability to stand next to an American president and project alignment. Behind both of these stories sits a quieter, more structural problem: whether the American military machine funding this campaign can actually keep sustaining it. Congressional testimony from military leadership this year has acknowledged strain on defense stockpiles and the industrial base supplying them. At the same time, the United States is trying to simultaneously deter China in the Pacific, continue supplying Ukraine, and sustain an open-ended air campaign against Iran. None of those obligations has gone away to make room for the others. That is the arithmetic problem sitting underneath the war fatigue narrative, not a question of willpower, but of whether the supply lines and the alliance structure can support a fourth major commitment indefinitely. None of this proves Iran is winning, and it would be dishonest to frame it that way. The counter case has real substance. Iran's nuclear program has been set back, its economy is under severe strain, its currency has lost significant value, and the government spent much of the summer engaged in indirect diplomacy rather than open refusal. A country in a position of strength does not typically negotiate. But the counter case has to explain why, 5 months into sustained pressure, Iran is not visibly contracting. It is opening new fronts, absorbing a Ukrainian strike on a second body of water without abandoning its primary confrontation, and managing a domestic crackdown severe enough to draw UN condemnation without triggering the kind of institutional fracture that ends wars from the inside. Pressure campaigns work when they produce cascading institutional failure. What Iran has shown across this war, whatever the human cost of how it has done so, is a system built specifically to resist that kind of collapse. The question this war keeps circling back to, 5 months and one Caspian Sea incident later, is not really about who is winning any single battle. It is whether the campaign that began in February with a defined target, Iran's nuclear and missile infrastructure, still has a definition at all, or whether it has become the kind of open-ended commitment that, in past American wars, proved far easier to start than to end. The Oman diplomacy is real, and it turns out to be more fragile than a simple hedging story. On July 28th, Oman handed Iran a Gulf-backed plan for jointly managing the Strait of Hormuz, modeled on the Strait of Malacca, where shipping companies pay voluntary contributions rather than a state-controlled toll. Washington opposes any transit fee at all, and Iran, for its part, rejected the Omani framework within a day. Iran's deputy foreign minister said the plan failed to address Tehran's security concerns and countered with its own proposal. Iran would control shipping through its side of the strait, and Oman would manage only part of the opposite lane, not all of it. That distinction matters more than it sounds. What's actually being negotiated in these back-channel talks isn't logistics, it's sovereignty over one of the most valuable choke points on Earth. Iran has treated formal recognition of its control over Hormuz as central leverage since the conflict began. Citing an earlier memorandum of understanding, it says, gave Tehran that authority under its Article 5, and it has repeatedly fired on vessels that used shipping lanes it hadn't approved. Reuters reporting and independent conflict trackers monitoring the war have both concluded that this isn't a peripheral dispute Iran will trade away for economic relief. It's the one demand Tehran has treated as non-negotiable through 5 months of strikes, a blockade, and a collapsed ceasefire. That context reframes something else worth noting. American airstrikes on Iran abruptly stopped after July 23rd, and Iran halted its own military action against U.S. positions around the same time. Trump described the two sides as having good talks, while also warning that strikes would resume if negotiations failed. Mediators, including Pakistan and Qatar, have floated a further 10-day ceasefire. None of that means the war is ending. It means the fighting and the diplomacy are now running on parallel tracks, an unofficial pause in the shooting, while both governments try to settle, on paper, the exact question the shooting never resolved. Who actually controls the strait once the guns go quiet? Put the two threads together, Isfahan and Hormuz, and a pattern comes into view. Inside its own borders, Iran is answering pressure with visible public force, an unmistakable signal to its own population that dissent still carries the harshest possible cost, even in wartime. Outside its borders, at the negotiating table, Iran is answering pressure by refusing to concede the one asset it has left that the rest of the world cannot simply rout around. Neither posture looks like a government preparing to capitulate. Both look like a government betting that it can absorb 5 more months of this if it has to, provided the alternative is giving up control of Hormuz for good. Whether that bet is right is the actual question this war has been asking since February, underneath every headline about missiles and every ceasefire that didn't hold. There is a third thread worth pulling on, because it shows the same hedging behavior happening across the Gulf, quietly, in the background of the missile strikes and the ceasefire talks. On July 26th, Kuwait formally ratified a defense cooperation agreement with Pakistan, a pact originally signed back in 2023 but left dormant until now, covering military training, intelligence sharing, logistics, and defense technology, running for an initial 5 years with automatic renewal built in. On its own, a ratified paper agreement isn't dramatic. What makes it worth noting is the timing and the pattern around it. Reuters reported weeks earlier that Pakistan had been negotiating a far more substantial version of this relationship with Kuwait, one modeled on Islamabad's existing defense pact with Saudi Arabia, which includes thousands of Pakistani troops stationed on Saudi soil, fighter jets, drones, and air defense systems. Kuwait, according to a Pakistani official briefed on the talks, is now looking for that same kind of visible security backstop. This is happening while the country sits a short missile flight from an active war zone, and while the government that has protected Gulf state security for decades, Washington, is simultaneously bombing Iran, negotiating with Iran, pausing the bombing, and threatening to resume it, all within the same month. Gulf states are not abandoning their American relationships, but they are visibly building parallel ones, with a nuclear-armed regional power that isn't a party to this war, at exactly the moment American strategy in the region looks least predictable. Step back from the individual headlines, and a single through line connects Isfahan, the Caspian Sea, the Hormuz negotiating table, and a defense pact ratified in Kuwait. Every actor touched by this war, ally and adversary alike, is behaving as though the current phase, American air superiority, a blockade, a fragile pause since July 23rd, is a temporary condition rather than a settled outcome. Iran is negotiating over sovereignty, not surrender. Spain and France are publicly breaking with Washington's legal framing while the war is still active. Gulf states that depend on the American security umbrella are quietly diversifying who else might hold it up. None of that is proof the war is being lost by the side spending the most money and dropping the most munitions. But it is proof that 5 months in, nobody in the region is behaving as though this is close to over, which is its own kind of answer to the question Washington has been trying to avoid since February. What does winning this war actually look like? And does anyone still fighting it agree on the definition?